Hello, my loves, and welcome. I, of course, am Rockette Fox, and it is my extreme pleasure and joy to come along with Random Ritual and bring you, upon this full moon, a little bit of a story, a tale, if you will, and I think you'll enjoy it. It's a little something that I'm particularly fond of. So, without further ado, join me as we take a little journey into the past. It was long ago, fairly long before memory becomes a little hazy. It was dark that night, but then again, it was always dark in those days. The sky hung heavy with the drops of unspoken rain, as if a torrent could wash away the stench of decay that hung like a taut noose over the stale air. I sat at my loom, the shuttle weaving back and forth, absent as long shadows danced opposite the restless flicker of my candle. It was silent, save the rhythmic tap, tap, tapping of my work against the slight crackle of the wick of the candle that it was getting low, but I had another nearby, within reach. I was always prepared. I remembered that's what my parents had always told me. In the roughly cobbled streets beyond my front door, I suddenly heard something. It was the unmistakably slow and heavy wooden roll of a cart's wheels, unevenly chunking along the path, accompanied by the slow shuffle of a man with a limp. My breath caught in my throat as it rolled ever so steadily closer. I realized I had been holding my breath. I had stopped weaving. I forced a shaky gulp of air where I heard the cart roll to an abrupt stop before my neighbor's door. I squinted my eyes as if my lessened sight would move the displaced senses into my ears. At first, nothing. Then I heard my neighbor's rough wooden door swing open as if blown by a gust of sudden wind. Quiet voices conferred in tones too low to discern. Then a pause. Silence. Then shuffles, movement. Then the sick thud of dead weight being thrown unceremoniously onto the full cart, its worn beams creaking loudly in protest. The wooden shuttle almost slipped from my fingers. As I listened, the cart of the dead had reached max capacity. Silence. And then, cha-chunk, cha-chunk. Shuffle, cha-chunk. It continued until my hearing could pick out no more. I tried to go back to my work, but my mind spun. Dozens of thin-legged spiders echoing the work of my hands in my brain. I set my shuttle and the coarse thread down, turning to face the interior of my modest home. There, across from the stool upon which I sat, the smoothly worn chair my father once sat. I could recall the rumble of his deep snore as he would lean back after a day of work in the fields, and the large copper pot that nestled where my mother would cook the stew day after day, its savory and fragrant smell filling every crevice of the room with warmth. Of course, that was before the death came. We were no strangers to taking ill once in a while, a cough here and a watering eye at the end of the day, but when it spread, when everyone began to fall ill without any sign of recovery, that's when we knew something was wrong, and when the weakness turned to death. I closed my eyes and turned back to my weaving. Idle hands and all, but it's what they say. But keeping busy would surely keep my mind preoccupied. But then, a sharp and sudden rap at the door shook me from my thoughts. Shooting a quick glance toward the night sky that peeked through the unlatched window just beneath my roof, I saw it was too late, far too late for any regular visitor. Then the knock came again, like the sound of bone against wood, and my hair stood on end. Who in their right mind would be out at a time like this, unless, well, what if it were an emergency of some kind? Well, and then I heard, "Please, won't you open the door for a poor old woman?" A reedy voice just beyond. I came to my feet and drifted toward the sound of the voice. Obviously, it was no bandit. Surely. There must be some sort of need to have come to my house at this hour. Creaking the door open just a bit and peeking, I spoke. Yes? Her arm, poised as if to knock once more, receded. The old woman stood a hair shorter than me. I looked. No. A full head. She was so small and frail and thin, as if held up by sheer will. The coarse fabric of her cloak hung from her frame, her ashen face partially hidden beneath a wide hood. I briefly caught a glimpse of something long and thin wrapped in a cloth at her side, but my eyes fell onto her face when the raising of her head brought her gaze to mine. And she cracked a painfully thin smile. "May I come in?" I began, but on seeing her move toward the door, an odd haze settled over my heavy mind. I couldn't seem to place what she might be doing there, and my obligation as the last remaining lady of the house took hold. Well, I swallowed my protest and stepped aside. She moved past me with a speed and finesse that belied someone of her stature, and glancing nervously into the full moonlight, I slid the door shut behind her. I stood watching as she made her way around the room with a familiarity that did nothing to quell my unease. "Yes, here. Your sister, was it not?" She spoke, pausing at the darkened doorway leading to the room where, one by one, I watched each member of my family fade. I remained silent, watching, waiting. Her sunken blue eyes almost gleamed from beneath the hood as she snickered. "I took them all, but she was the last." I could feel my body trembling as she continued to slowly circle the edge of the room. I began to move opposite her, keeping a wide swath of space between us. "Pesta," I breathed almost inaudibly, and as soon as I uttered her name. The odd spell was broken. She threw back her head and cackled. The cloak slid from her form, melting into the shadows. A mess of wild white hair piled atop her head, and her blood-red skirt seemed to vanish and reappear with every step. You know me, and you let me in all the same. Pesta, the old woman who was the Black Death itself. Her skirt, they said, was stained with the deep crimson from the blood of those she killed. Her hollow cheeks emblazoned with the lines and edges of her sharp smile, and at her side, always a broom or a rake. A rake would spare some in the community, their lives slipping just between the ragged prongs, but a broom, well, that meant everyone would be swept away. My eyes fell to the long cloth bound at the parcel in her hand. I'd never seen her myself, but I had heard the tales. First, I came for your father. She took a step and I backed away. When the death first came, I wanted to be prepared. I sought the wisest in the village, but they were no help. Then they were gone. When I was the only one left of my family, I sought the woman in the woods. Malevolent or not, she would certainly know about such things, and I had nothing else to lose. Then I came for your mother. The old woman took another step. I had sat at the woman in the woods table for 3 days, while she prepared a concoction in a pot blacker than any metal I had ever seen. Water bubbled and simmered as she pulled from strangely colored jars bits of spice and plant, clove, cinnamon, rosemary, thyme, myrrh, a strange, fragrant leaf I'd never seen. Beneath a heavy round stone, the ingredients crackled and ground into a fine powder before she carefully scraped all of it into her pot, beside a lemon, whispering something I couldn't quite hear. Next, I came for your sister. Pesta coiled, as if a snake ready to strike. The woman in the woods boiled the ingredients for the entirety of the 3 days, adding in small bits of ground powder and whispering until only the essence remained. She pulled a vial from a basket and plunged it into the pot, filling the vessel to the brim before firmly corking it, advising I keep it on my person at all times. I never questioned it. Now, I have come for you. In a single motion, the old woman pulled the cloth from the package at her side, revealing a black, crackled broom, bristles drenched in decay, and she launched across the room with a screech. My hands fell into my pockets, retrieving the vial, my protection fumbling. I pulled it close to my chest, loosened, and pulled the cork free with a pop. Shaking, I cried out, "By shield of night and full moon's light, please protect me from my plight!" And I flung the contents at the Pesta. As she flew toward me, sputtering and coughing, the old woman crashed to the ground in a heap. Roaring, she glared up at me, coming to her feet and raising the broom over her head when suddenly she stopped. The tips of the bristles flaked and cracked, tiny debris falling to the floor. As she struggled to hold the handle tighter, more began to crumble away like ash after a fire burned itself out. "What have you done?" She shrieked at me, her eyes alight. I didn't answer. Bracing myself, she snarled but stayed at a distance. You! She tore toward the door that threw itself open before she spun to face me once more, the smallest bits of her broom still slipping through her fingers. You will pay for this! And she was gone as my door slammed itself shut once more. I stood in place for what seemed like an eternity before I willed myself to breathe once more. My eyes scanned the room in a daze. Black scorches across my floor, piles of dust and grit scattered everywhere. After an eternity more, I moved absently back to my loom. I would clean another time. Considering what had occurred, another time, perhaps, but not now. Now, I would preoccupy myself, keep my hands busy. I sat at the soft, flickering orange glow, taking the shuttle with the coarse string into my hands when my candle went out.